Major tension points that we need to wrestle with when it comes to pastoral care and clergy care and care for our leaders that are in the conversations that when we're trying to answer the question, who should be doing the care and what should the care look like? And the three tension points that we need to wrestle with and see where we sit really sit around what I call companionship versus accountability, sharing versus processing, and holding versus moving. Let me explain those tension points a little bit. So when we talk about companionship versus accountability, we're talking about the kind of care that is present. There's a big distinction between the idea of I am sitting here just as a friend, just to care and just to hear, and we're going to hold this together. That's different conversation than when I'm sitting with someone to whom I am accountable, who may have a vested interest in the outcome of my behavior or what change happens or what change happens so quickly or the impact of the pain. And this is where we really sit in the conversations of power structures and organizational dynamics. And one of the things that when I work with organizations, one of the things that we talk about a lot is there is an inherent limit to how vulnerable someone can be with someone who holds the capacity to fire them. It just is inherent that it is inherently less safe to be vulnerable with someone who has power and control over some of the directions and outcomes and access points of your life. And that's not a deal breaker, but it is something to be attentive to, that when we're thinking within our organizations about how do we create vulnerable spaces and safe spaces for healing for people to be honest and to wrestle with things together, we can't dismiss the impact that it has on the environment in this tension between, is this a companionship relationship, or is there an element of accountability in this relationship? Because that has a great significance on how far vulnerability can go and how raw and unfiltered it can become. And so we pay attention to this tension between, are we companioning or are we creating context of accountability in which some of the power structures sit? And this is one of the reasons why Church Well Co. Often operates as a denominationally adjacent organization, where we create spaces of companionship with people who aren't going to fire you or engage in some of the ways that are necessary within an organizational structure to keep things moving. And so we talk about companionship and accountability as one of the tension points. The second tension point that we wrestle with as we examine who should do care and what care should look like is whether it is a sharing conversation or a processing conversation. In the way that I describe this is processing conversations are, I may come to it without a lot of clarity of even where I am or what the outcome is going to be, and we wrestle with together to figure out what is it that is there. Maybe we discover things together, maybe we unpack, maybe we put new language on things and we organize it and we process it and we get it a little bit more understood and identifiable. And that's a processing conversation where we're working with raw emotion and raw concepts and raw experiences. A sharing conversation holds a great deal of vulnerability, but it is we take what we have processed, where it is more organized, and we bring that new conversation, we share what we have processed. And so it doesn't have the risk factor of, I don't know necessarily what I'm going to discover as I start to talk this through with you, which sits in a processing conversation. There's a deep risk when we enter into processing conversations with people of going like, how are you going to experience what I might discover about me in this conversation? That's really, really risky. It is still vulnerable, but a little less risky to come into conversations where I am sharing with you things that have been processed. So when we think about care for pastors in vulnerable spaces, one of the questions that we need to wrestle with is, are we creating spaces for processing that has room to be, to kind of meander, that has room to be perhaps a little bit unknown in discovery as we go? And is there room for care in the discovery of that? Or are these conversations that need to be much more sharing oriented, where we need to be able to come into these spaces having a little bit more of an idea of what we are going and not going to share as we engage in that? So we have companioning versus accountability dynamics. We have sharing versus processing conversations. And then the third tension has to do with directionality. In the language we use is we talk about holding versus moving relationships. And this is actually one of the major distinctions I make when I think about the contrast of the role of like a counselor and of a pastor. When we think about pastoring, we think of this idea of shepherding, and inherently in pastoring and shepherding, there is this idea of movement, that we're walking our people from one place to another, from one field to another. We're walking them into growth and we're walking them into food. And there is an intention intentional design and need and purpose of movement, like we're going somewhere, and we can discuss the pace of movement and where we're going, and all of that is negotiable, but the movement piece is kind of built into this idea of shepherding and where are we going. When we talk about holding, and this is something that the therapeutic community and in counseling spaces and in spiritual direction leans a lot more in this side of things, is just this space of going, we're just going to pause and slow down, and we're just going to hold this moment, or we're just going to hold this thing. And we're going to discover together, and movement may come from it. There may be growth and there may be healing, but the moment that we're sitting in itself doesn't necessitate movement. We don't have to go anywhere. We don't have to do anything with this. We can sit and examine and look at it and notice it together and see where God is in it and see what God brings up and see how God shows up and meets us in the moment. But holding moments are different than movement moments. And so when we think about care in the context of care and who does the care, part of that is also paying attention to us am I someone who can hold, just sit in a moment, hold, or is there something in me that goes, okay, I can hold it, but I want to do something with it. Like, where are we going to go with this? Then we want to be attentive to that, so that it might actually make more sense for us to be in contexts that are movement oriented and care for people in movement ways. But when we have people who are shepherding, who are moving people who hold an intent of, like, we're going to get here, but we're going to go somewhere with this. When they are sitting with people who really just need to be held, and had a moment where we stop and we see, the mixing of those two tends to undermine safety, undermine trust, makes moments, it brings tension in the conversations when we're not clear on what are we doing. So those three tension points, really, we need to really be attentive to think through, are these spaces companioning or accountability? And is the person leading these spaces an accountability figure or just a companion? Are we sharing or are we processing? Because there's different levels of vulnerability and risk in those conversations. And are we holding? Is this a space where there's room to hold? Or are we moving, and is there an agenda? Are we trying to go somewhere? And those are different conversations in different kinds of spaces. And so we really want to be thoughtful about those three tension points as we think through the spaces of care that we need for ourselves, the spaces that we're creating for our people, and how we navigate those spaces together.